Welcome to the first ever virtual Progressive Strategy Summit. I'm Liz Watson, the Executive Director of the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. We're here to support the movement and fight for progressive change in Congress. And I am so thrilled to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, the people have spoken. Organizers galvanized record turnout across the nation to deliver the most votes ever cast in a presidential election, with Black and brown voters and young voters delivering an overwhelming victory for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the first ever Black and Indian American woman to be elected on the presidential ticket. And the people elected a Congress that has more women, LGBTQ, Black, and Indigenous lawmakers in it than ever before. We didn't get here by accident. We've been through a lot in the last 4 years that has tested our mettle. From the Muslim ban to the ban on trans people in the military, to babies being ripped from their parents' arms, to Black men and women being murdered by police. The hard truth is, in many ways, the Trump era is not an aberration. It's a culmination of a long sordid history in our country of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and runaway inequality. But over the past 4 years, the progressive movement has demonstrated over and over that we will not be silent in the face of injustice. I've never, ever seen anything like the astonishing and awesome activism of this moment. You've been marching and organizing since day one. The day after President Trump's inauguration, women of color led millions in the Women's March in cities across the nation and the world. When President Trump ordered the Muslim ban, lawyers and protesters headed to the airports. After the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, young people organized the March for Our Lives, and they called BS on the gun lobby and its enablers. Union members and working people marched in cities across the country against union busting and the blatant disregard for the health and safety of essential workers. And this summer, after the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, tens of millions took to the streets, masks and all, and chanted Black Lives Matter. First, you marched in the streets, and then you marched to the polls in record numbers. As we gather here today, I am so proud and relieved to say that we are turning a new page for our nation, thanks to hard work by people dedicated to a future more just than our past. And now we've got our work cut out for us. Due to the Trump administration's incompetence, millions have contracted a deadly virus and hundreds of thousands have died. Children have gone hungry, and with the virus surging, millions of people are still out of work. And we know that too many people were living in crisis before the pandemic even started, especially poor people, people of color, and young people. Too many entered this pandemic without healthcare, without savings to fall back on, without childcare, without paid family leave. That's why we're demanding bold solutions at the scale of the crises we face. This is what the people want. The vast majority of Americans say they would join a union if they could. Fox News election exit polling showed 72% of voters favored a guaranteed healthcare plan. 2/3 of voters support a wealth tax. 2/3 of voters want a $15 minimum wage, a victory that Florida, a state that went for Trump, just delivered at the ballot box. So it's up to us to work together for the solutions we need to realize the promise of our democracy, one in which every single one of us is thriving. It's up to us to fight for financial relief for those who need it during this pandemic, who are facing homelessness and who are out of work. It's up to us to solve the healthcare and childcare crises this pandemic has exposed. It's up to us to work for a future in which we choose what we do with our own bodies and where our sexuality or gender identity isn't held against us. It's up to us to unrig an economy built by Black, brown, and poor people that only benefits corporations and their CEOs. It's up to us to fight for the freedom to join a union. It's up to us to end police brutality. It's up to us to end voter suppression. It's up to us to repair our relationship with the world, to make this a nation that provides refuge for people fleeing persecution and violence, to restart the work to address the climate crisis and end systemic racism in all its twisted forms. I believe in us. I believe in the incredible power of grassroots organizers, thought leaders, and the progressive champions elected to Congress, including our outstanding CPC co-chairs, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal and Congressman Mark Pocan, who you will hear from in just a minute, and the newly elected members you'll meet later today. I'm so excited to hear from many of you over the next 2 days about how we can work together to build a more resilient nation. And now I'm thrilled to welcome Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson to open this virtual gathering. Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson is a pastor, a philanthropist, and an activist. He's a national thought leader in racial justice, community organizing, and movement building. He's a long-standing champion for children's rights. And in the wake of the 2014 shooting of teenager Michael Brown, Reverend Dr. Wilson co-chaired the Ferguson Commission, which released Forward Through Ferguson, A Path Toward Racial Equity, a report calling for sweeping changes in policing, the criminal justice system, child well-being, and economic mobility. In December, Reverend Dr. Wilson will begin his tenure as president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Liz, for the invitation and the opportunity to share. Thank you to all of our friends and partners at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, not just for the opportunity to be with you virtually, but for the work and the fight that you continue to be in each and every day, for me, for my children, for all of America's children. People will remember 2020 for so many things. I'm excited that this will also be remembered as a turning point in the progressive movement. Many will mark this year for a global pandemic, where we've lost more than 250,000 lives, where more than 100,000 Americans daily are contracting COVID-19. Some will remember for this summer's protests that mobilized, catalyzed, and activated millions of people to join this movement for justice, to be heard, to stand up, to stand out, and to speak up, calling for transformative legislation in the names of George Floyd and John Lewis, and those last words of George Floyd, calling for breath. Many will remember this year for a transformative, perhaps, presidential election, one that engaged more Americans in the franchise than any before. 70 million who came out to express their opinions, their voice with their vote, and 75 million more who decided that it was time for change. With all of that transformation in mind, I actually want to turn your attention as you center on this progressive work, this progressive agenda on 74 million people. 74 million people who didn't get to vote, the 74 million people who didn't get a voice, the 74 million people who have no lobbyists, and the 74 million people who can't make campaign contribution, the 74 million children and youth under the age of 18 in America who need a progressive agenda, who need progressive power to work for them. This moment in American history could be remembered for a pandemic or a protest or a presidential election. Or we could remember that this is the first time in American history, according to census reports, that the majority of America's children are children of color, which means they're more likely to grow up in poverty. They're more likely to grow up in food insecure homes. They're more likely to wrestle with lack of access to health care. 12 million of them lived in poverty before the pandemic. 1 in every 5 children, the poorest demographic in America, our kids. 22 million, 22% of them have parents who are unemployed right now, raising the stakes of toxic stress in the home. Those 74 million human lives are relying on each and every one of us to build progressive power for an agenda that will leave them with a more resilient nation and a more resilient world. And so I'm grateful for this virtual gathering. I'm grateful for a critical agenda that has produced a HEROES Act that still needs action and will need Congress to take it up to transform America for our children, to rebuild an America for our children. I'm grateful for all of you who have fought to make sure the Breathe Act has life and its provisions to make sure a safe and thriving environment where we're investing in our communities that have been minoritized and marginalized for too long can actually get life, can get a hearing, can get action. I'm glad that John Lewis's name will not go down in vain, but rather there are progressives like each and every one of you who will be working to be sure that voting rights is not simply something we speak of from an era of civil rights in the past, but rather is centered in a new movement for justice and Black lives. I am glad that we will take seriously those final words of George Floyd, crying out for breath, and we will transform policing in America because we will build the power to get it done. I'm glad that there are so many of you who can come together and celebrate the transformation that can come from a presidential election, and also understand that building power in the halls of Congress and in the streets of America is critically important for making sure that the nation is resilient, putting policy and power building together for a progressive agenda. And I'm glad that I get to be a part of the conversations with you on behalf of the 74 million children of America who need us to get this done. And so thank you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for advancing it forward. I look forward to being in the fight in the center with each and every one of you for all of America's children. Thank you again, Liz, for the opportunity to be with you. I invite you to join me as I turn my attention virtually back to Liz Watson, the Executive Director of the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And now we are so excited to transition to Lorella Praeli of Community Change Action. Lorella, take it away.
Thank you, Liz. I'm so happy to be here with you and with this incredible group of panelists. I want to offer a few reflections on the moment before we dive into our discussion. First and foremost, we must be confident about the election results and what our communities delivered. Black, Brown, AAPI, Indigenous voters, immigrants, young people, and women delivered big wins for Democrats. We overcame voter suppression, misinformation, stacked courts, violence, and a global pandemic. And we won the White House, the House, and the popular vote. And now the Senate will be determined in January, and I am optimistic because there are groups like New Georgia Project on the ground working to fight for every vote. So we must own that reality as we continue to build power and demand that those in elected office fight to advance a majoritarian agenda. And because our communities delivered, we can and must lean into our vision for a more just and free country. We are in a powerful position to hold the new administration and the new Congress accountable to their commitments to make real the promise of racial justice, to democratize our government's institutions, to create good care and green jobs for all workers, and to legalize the 11 million. We must do all of this with an eye towards 2022 and 2024. We need to see tangible results for our base, immediate improvements in the material conditions of the lives of our communities, especially working class communities and communities of color, while at the same time building power to make transformative change in the long term. I am joined this afternoon by an all-star panel. Let me introduce you. Congressman Mark Pocan is co-chair of the CPC and represents Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal is also co-chair of the CPC and represents Washington's 7th District. President of the National Education Association, Becky Pringle, leads the nation's largest union with 3 million members and is also here today. And finally, my dear friend, all of your friends, Vanita Gupta, is president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I really cannot think of a better group to help us make meaning and ground us in this moment. So let's start with the big picture post-election. Congressman Pocan, how would you describe the moment that we are in?
Well, thank you very much, and for that kind introduction. Let me just first say I want to thank the Progressive Caucus Action Fund and Liz, who leads both that and the Progressive Caucus Center, for all the hard work, both on this, but everything they've been doing. Really fantastic work. I think the reality of the moment that we're in right now, post-election, is taking a quick look at what we did. We have elected a new Democratic president and vice president, and we should all celebrate in doing that by one of the largest electoral college victories in modern history when you look at it in the end. We also have to have the reality of a U.S. Senate that right now the Republicans are at 50 seats, and we have 2 seats to pick up potentially in Georgia, but the reality is they have 50 seats. We need to get to 50 seats. Part of that moment we're in right now is the U.S. House of Representatives still having a Democratic majority, but a more narrow Democratic majority, and dealing with that. And I think it's worth saying part of the moment we're in is the moment of a 100-year pandemic. And we clearly know what that's done. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, millions of people infected with COVID, an economy where 1 out of every 5 small businesses has gone out of business just since the start of the COVID crisis, and millions of people out of work at no fault of their own. So we have a lot in the moment, but I think maybe a better way that I would like to phrase it is it's not so much about having the moment, but having a movement. And that's what we have, right? So let's celebrate the movement that we have. And the movement we have really is one where we have so many progressives across the country came out during that election. That is really the reason why we are at the place we are with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris coming in to be president and vice president. My district alone, I look at, we had an additional 35,000 votes for Joe Biden in a very progressive 2nd Congressional District out of Wisconsin. That alone was enough to flip Wisconsin, much less many other efforts that happened statewide. But it really was that progressive movement that made that happen. I think our progressive groups right now, watching the energy that we have there, so much is going to be relying on that relationship with all of the progressive groups that are out there and the progressive members of Congress, largely in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, of course, working together so that we're one fluid movement going forward as we try to put ideas forward and try to make sure that good people are being appointed to important positions, make sure good legislation is moving forward and we can make things bigger and bolder and better because we are one big movement. I think that's really important to look at. And also, I think the reality is there are some folks out there trying to fight us from the very first day. With less than 48 hours after the election, we had folks who said, oh, it's because people said defund the police or said they were socialists or anything else that didn't actually occur. But they're trying to paint progressives somehow as the reason why we didn't pick up as many House seats. We all know that's ridiculous. Anyone who 48 hours out of the election decided that they know it all really knows nothing, in my opinion, because it shows how little they actually know to assume their district is what happened across the country. But we are fighting against those narratives. So I just think this moment we're in is one about working together on the messaging and what we're trying to say. This is a moment that we work together to get all of our organizations out there to help bring calls into Congress. The goal should be in this moment, in this movement, is that we get together so much effort coming from progressive groups, calling members of Congress, that people want to do what we're proposing they do because they're hearing it from their districts. And that is the single, I think, best thing we can do in the moment, but more importantly, the movement that we're in.
Thank you. Congresswoman Jayapal, the 2020 election saw the highest voter turnout in history. In fact, I think congratulations are in order because I believe you have won the most votes of any members of Congress again. So huge congratulations. But this isn't driven truly in large part by years of on the ground organizing in the states. And unfortunately, Trump's 2016 voters did not reject him in significant numbers. So how do you interpret these results in this moment?
Thank you, Lorella, and thank you to Liz and the Progressive Caucus Action Fund for all the amazing work. I think that the reality is we do have a very divided country, and I think many of us wanted to see a massive moral repudiation of Donald Trump. We got a political repudiation for sure, with Joe Biden winning by all accounts with a real clear mandate, over 300 electoral college votes, over 5 million and rising votes from Americans across the country. But the reality is there are still a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. And I think that it all boils down to whether people see their lives better. That is what it's all about. And I will just say, I think that when we passed a $15 minimum wage here in Seattle, we were the first major city in the country to pass that. People called a $15 minimum wage a far left radical idea. Well, guess what? Florida has now passed it, even as they went for Donald Trump. So I really think that we need to drive a different narrative of what is a populist, working people, vulnerable people, poor people's agenda that is going to bring results to people. Because if you look at the results, and I think we progressives should celebrate. We're not very good at celebrating. We're not very good at victories. This is a massive victory because we were both the movers of the most progressive presidential agenda in recent history. That's Joe Biden's agenda, very progressive agenda, partly because of the work that our organizers and our progressives did with the Biden campaign. Secondly, we were the translators of that message on the ground, and we were the organizers of people as they were determining whether or not they thought they would give democracy one more chance. And I think this is important because if we do not deliver results, we will lose people potentially for a generation. And I'll just give my 23-year-old as an example. Trans kid of color who studied racial justice and who deeply believes that both parties have failed them. Both parties have failed them, that we have not delivered a future where they can look and know that they're going to have a planet, that they and their friends are going to be able to get a higher education without mountains of debt, that there are people in Congress fighting for them that really are going to pay attention to them and not to the lobbyists that have all the money that are lining our doors. So this is the moment we're in where I think we have to do everything we can on the ground on day one after the election, not 30 days before the election, but on day one to speak to people about what we stand for and what we're going to do. That is person to person conversation. And, you can do all the TV ads you want. You can have all the money you want. I'm not saying those things aren't important, but you and I know, Lorella, as organizers on the ground in the trenches, if you will, that person to person conversation, that deep listening and that sort of deep canvassing model of organizing is what we need to do. And we've got to fire on every cylinder. Because we are losing even Black voters, Latino voters to Donald Trump. Why? We've been shouting from the rooftops for a decade for our own party to pay attention to Black voters, to Latino voters, to AAPI voters, to young people, and to actually consider this base, which is not really a base yet, but this group of voters as the biggest group of, if you want to call it, swing voters. They decide every election whether or not they're going to give democracy a chance, whether they're going to give the idea that their vote matters. And the reason they decide is because we don't deliver enough for them to have them believe that there's a difference. So that's the work I think we have to do. And I'm excited to do it because, frankly, I'm happy that progressive ideas like a $15 minimum wage, like marijuana legalization, has done so well, even in Republican districts. And I think if we build up the power of working people, and let's not forget that Black Lives Matter movement, as much as people want to point fingers, the Black Lives Matter movement delivered Black voters and people who believe in Black Lives Matter to the polls again and again and again in districts that we would have lost, in states that we would have lost had they not come out. So I'm excited to get to work with that. I'm an ever optimist because you can't be an activist without being an optimist. But I also believe we got to be bold, we got to be courageous, and we have to show people quickly that we care about them, their pocketbooks, their livelihoods, and their futures.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that there truly are no shortcuts to building power, right? Like if we don't do the work, if the party does not invest in low-income voters and voters of color, there is no roadmap. There is no path to victory. Now I'm going to turn to Vanita. Vanita, you have been at the forefront of making sure that we secure and protect the results of this election. And so we've just had, right, an unprecedented election season. We're still in the midst of it, right? Votes are still being counted. The control for the Senate will not be determined until January. And the past few years have really been a stress test for our democracy. Now, I often think about Ganesha's quote when he writes, democracy is always something that has to be achieved. And I'm curious for you, has democracy survived? And what are we now in a position to fix?
Thank you, Lorella, both for your leadership and your sage words always, and Liz to the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. So has democracy survived? I actually firmly believe that this election really was a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. And I love that nobody has mentioned the sideshow that is happening right now in the White House with a president who is refusing to be in reality and understand that the voters have decided that President-elect Biden will be occupying the White House on January 20th. Our democracy has taken a very bad beating over the last several years. And this period right now, we need to be very clear. Donald Trump is not going to succeed in changing the outcome of the election. I think most of the Republicans around him that have been silent in this moment actually know that. He isn't, the litigation, the efforts, all of these things, the DOJ action. This is all an effort to sow chaos, disruption, and delegitimize the outcome of an election where an overwhelming record number of Americans voted, and the majority of whom voted for Biden. And so what I do believe, however, is that this is a very dangerous moment. The election didn't end the danger zone for our democracy. And I think we have to be willing to understand that this moment right now is also a dangerous moment where you have a president who has, throughout this election cycle, been seeding massive amounts of disinformation with the express purpose of polarizing our nation, dividing our nation, delegitimizing the outcome of an election. And I suspect this is also not going to end on January 20th, that this will be an effort that will exist in our midst throughout a Biden administration. And so I think we have a lot of work to do as a nation. It's not like this nation ever had the golden era of democracy. When you think the nation was obviously founded on racial exclusion, gender exclusion in voting. And so we have a long history of problems in access to the right to vote. This election season is a little confusing though, because we are celebrating the record high voter turnout, and it was across the board for every candidate in every state, in every race. There was record high turnout. And that is actually something really to be celebrated. We have had historically low voter turnout. And the thing that I really appreciate in this moment is I think that, you know, Americans understood that what was at stake with this election, the kinds of issues that Congresswoman Jayapal is talking about, people understood that these are the issues on the ballot in this election. And so we should celebrate that, and we should find a way to sustain that. But we also know that a lot of people felt like this election represented a crisis. And from wherever you sit, however you define that. We have a lot of work to do, though. We have had a battering consistently of voting rights for the last decade, in a fairly intentional effort by too many Republicans. This has become a very partisan issue. I think it's like people forget that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in every cycle from 1965, from its original passage to its final reauthorization before the United States Supreme Court gutted it, under a Republican president, and where one House of Congress was under Republican rule. The whole aspect of voting rights now has been so weaponized. And even amid a pandemic, when we were fighting to expand voting options to make sure voters of all stripes in every background could actually exercise our right to vote, we were not, it was met with such resistance and record amounts of litigation. In 2019, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1, passed H.R. 4. These are efforts to engage voting rights reform, judicial ethics reform, money in politics reform, restore the Voting Rights Act, expand voting rights and access to the ballot, and fight disinformation and fight corruption and make our democracy work for all of us. These are some of the foundational issues that we need to contend with as a country. And of course, the outcome of the Senate is going to matter in whether these measures are going to see success in the Senate. But we cannot lose sight of the work that we have. And I think a record number of Americans are right now focused on voting and elections in our democracy. And I hope that progressives will understand this is the moment to seize, to make sure people understand how this bucket of issues matters to all of the other issues that matter for our families: healthcare and justice reform and jobs and minimum wage and the like.
Thank you, Vanita. Again, democracy as something that always has to be achieved, right? What a reminder to all of us, especially in this election season. Becky, I'm going to turn to you. The COVID-19 pandemic has really magnified the deep structural inequality in our country. As you and all the members of NEA know, the racial and the socioeconomic disparities are especially clear when we look at education. So really, how do we build back better, to take the president-elect's slogan, for children and families?
Thank you so much, Lorella, and thank you to the Progressive Caucus Action Fund and Liz. It is an honor to join you in this space with these incredible fellow panelists. You know, I could just say, Lorella, what they said, because everything that each of the fellow panelists said has an impact on what happens for our kids. But I am also an optimist, and I am hopeful, and I am inspired by the work that we are going to get to do together. And we do have to be bold, and we do have to be courageous, and we do have to act now if we are going to finally address the inequities that honestly we all know have been built into the education system. The very first thing that has to be done, and you see President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Can I just smile for a minute? You know, I could not agree more. Representative Pocan, you know, we just have to take joy in the moment for what we have accomplished. What we have accomplished as we all dealt with the attacks on our values, on just on our spirits and our souls, and how we came together after 4 years of darkness, and came together and we won, So I just want to honor that in this moment. But the very first thing you saw President-elect Biden talk about was control of the pandemic. And that absolutely is front and center for us in education. We saw, the country saw, what we in education have been seeing forever. Because as educators, we've been standing in those gaps. But the pandemic just brought this bright light on what has been happening in our education system, and quite honestly through this country forever. And then of course it exacerbated it. So one of the reasons I started out by saying, whatever all of my fellow panelists said applies to education, because everything impacts education. Everything impacts our students' ability to learn. So when we talk about justice, we're talking about housing justice. We're talking about economic justice. We're talking about climate justice. We're talking about racial justice. All of that is education justice. And so as we think about the disparate impact that the coronavirus has had on us and the crises that were spawned from it, of course, our Native students and our Black and Brown students have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus and the fallout from that. We knew as soon as most of our students went to virtual learning back in the spring, that these communities were going to be disparately impacted, as they always are. Our communities already were suffering from the reality that they lived in, too many of them lived in food deserts. So when they didn't have access to school lunches, and not just for them, but for their families, that impacted their ability to learn. We've known forever that there's a digital divide, that there are too many of our students that don't have access to the internet or to tools. We've talked about that as the homework gap forever. And yet we still, as a country, have not closed those gaps. And now we have the majority of our students in a virtual learning environment where too many of them don't have access to digital tools. We know that the systemic inequities that have been built in this system of education, based on race and economic status, on geography, on the zip code that our students live in, is something that we absolutely must focus on in a Biden-Harris administration. We know that the distribution of resources and the quality of facilities and the offerings of courses in schools, the access to nurses and librarians and smaller class sizes, all of these things are on the agenda to finally live up the promise of public education for our students. We know that COVID-19, all it did was exacerbated those disparities. And we know that to build back better, we not only have to look at how we're closing those gaps right now in this moment, but we have to close them systemically. We are educating the whole student. And so it has to be that shared responsibility of ensuring that every one of our students, everyone, gets what they need when they need it. And so it is going to take all of us to live up to that promise of public education. And I am looking forward to partnering with all of you and the Biden-Harris administration to do just that.
And we are so lucky to be led by you, Becky. You said this, and it's so profound that as educators, right, our educators have been standing in those gaps, right? And so this is a moment for action for our elected officials. Now, I'm gonna do a little quick lightning round. We've actually received several viewer questions for this panel. We're hearing from Eleanor LeClain at the Progressive Radio Network, who asked, what are the top 3 things Biden needs to do right away? Now let's make that 4 things and get one from each of you. I'm going to start quickly to take moderator's privilege and respond to this question and then turn to each of you. I'd like to see the new administration go big and bold on immigration, on all things, but I'm going to talk about immigration, not only to undo every harmful Trump executive order and rule affecting immigrants and refugees, but also to use the expansive executive authority to proactively begin to overhaul and to shrink the immigration enforcement machinery, including a moratorium on deportations and enforcement to stem the pain immediately. I'd also like to see the president-elect and the vice president-elect come out strong to finally legalize the 11 million who remain undocumented in our country. Now, there's a lot that they can do. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Becky, to ask you quickly, what are the top things that Biden needs to get going on immediately?
So in education, he needs to begin by reversing the detrimental actions of one Betsy DeVos. From disinvestment in public education, which we've seen over these 4 years, that has significantly impacted our students who are living in poverty, our students with special needs, to the basic student civil rights, something we didn't think we'd have to call out. The Department of Education has an Office of Civil Rights that has been rolled back and defunded. We have got to stand up for our students' civil rights. We have got to reverse what she did on Title IX and all that she did to threaten our LGBTQ students' rights. So for us, it is about student civil rights.
Thank you, Becky. Vanita?
I'm going to cheat and do two. There's like 100, but I think the first order of business is on COVID-19 relief. And I know that's a big package, but I think it is utterly shameful that Senator McConnell has held up the HEROES Act for so many months and that we haven't seen COVID relief package get passed in Congress at this moment. And so even while I know a Biden administration is going to be digging in with Congress to make sure that there's a robust package, I think there's going to need to be immediate executive actions on day one to help families and communities that are really suffering and don't have adequate access to healthcare, jobs. I think Becky's been talking about our kids who haven't been able to return to school and to deal with these issues. And then the second thing is, I think to Becky's point, a Biden administration needs to reinvigorate the civil rights machinery across the federal government. This pandemic has not hit all communities evenly. It's been devastating for the whole country, but we need to recognize that essential workers at the front lines have been hit the hardest. Many of them are Black and brown. And we need to make sure that we've got reinvigorated civil rights offices, including, of course, at my prior place of employment at the Justice Department, to make sure that we are sending a message loud and clear, and that the Biden administration is sending this message that civil rights enforcement is going to be a key priority for a new administration.
Thank you, Vanita. I'm going to go to you, Congresswoman Jayapal, and then to the Congressman.
Yeah, I'm going to say raise the minimum wage to 15. Cancel student debt, if not all of it, at least significant portions of it. Those are both things that will reach Black, brown, and white voters across the country and will make an immediate difference in their pocketbooks. And because I did those so quickly, I'm going to say a third one, which is climate. We need to fight for climate justice. And there are many, many things that Joe Biden can do, including what he said in the campaign, which was remarkable, and we should celebrate our own victory, that 40% of funds that are going to fight climate change would go to BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, folks of color communities, because those are the communities that have borne the biggest burden. There's so much that can be done administratively, even if we have an obstructionist Senate. We got to show a path forward for saving our planet and our people.
Thank you. Congressman Pocan?
Yeah, I was going to answer it in this way. You know, some of that bleach that he had saved up to inject into people, I would use it to wipe things down and debug the place. That's what I would do first. But more to your question on executive orders, first, everyone had great ones. Reverse the executive orders in the Department of Labor and around environmental issues. One, we've made it harder for workers to have a voice in their workplace, and it really affects income inequality. And second, get us back in that Paris Climate Agreement and reverse some of the things that have made it harder for us to have clean water and air.
Okay, I'm just going to make a note here that most of us cheated on this question, but that is okay. We're all excited and we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and move into a conversation
quickly, at least, Lorella.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and move into the conversation that's been playing out in Congress and in the election, right? This conversation about foundational change. So I'm going to start with you, Congressman Pocan. We heard from Joe in San Francisco, who wrote, I want to know how Democrats in leadership positions will respond to Republican obstructionism, right? We've all been talking about really needing to deliver for working class people, for all people in our country. And so from procedural motions in the House to filibusters in the Senate, do we seem to face structural barriers to progressive policy goals? And if so, what can we do?
Absolutely. That's a great question from the gentleman. First of all, let me just talk about the Senate. It's going to depend what happens in Georgia, how those rules are going to happen. I was very disheartened to see yesterday Senator Manchin say that if it was a 50-50 Senate, he wouldn't vote to do some of the changes they need to do. He put out an odd tweet that said, defund his butt, defend my butt, I believe he said. I don't quite know because he was talking about police. But I think that might show a little bit of the mentality that we're fighting with in the Senate. Even if we get to the 50 seats, we're going to have to get through some people like Senator Manchin and others to get the right things. But there's absolutely structural barriers there. In the House, we have been proposing as a Progressive Caucus, Pramila and I have been, along with our members, have been very outspoken on changes we need around the pay-go rule. We've been able to get around it largely in the last session every time when there's been something important to put up there, but we want to make sure it's not a barrier ever to moving progressive, big, bold legislation. There's some other ways we can do it as well. And Pramila in particular has been working very hard on this effort. And I want to give her a lot of credit for meeting even with the Blue Dogs, which can, if I had hair in my head, you'd lose sometimes in talking to them. She has done an especially strong job on this. The motion to recommit has been something the Republicans have used in a very political way. And I think we've been taking the little silver lure in front of us way too often. I think we'd like to see some changes around that in the House. And then things like inherent contempt as well, we'd like to work on. The difficulty is we have a much tighter margin in the House. I think the bottom line that'll help us get around all of this is we have to encourage Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to use executive orders and rule changes aggressively, early, and in many areas. That is going to be our single best way to be able to get around any obstructionism or tight vote margins.
Thank you. Becky, when we talk about structural reform, labor truly has to be a part of that equation. And so how can we strengthen the labor movement in the next Congress and in the administration?
So beginning with acknowledging that the labor movement is responsible for the middle class in this country. And as we saw the numbers in the labor movement, as they were under attack diminish, so did the number of the people in this country who are in the middle class. So we have to make sure that educators and other workers have the right and the security to speak up for, in our case, what's best for our students and for their families and for their communities. It's a central tenet to making sure we have that every one of our schools looks like the best public school. You know that 80% of the richest people in this country send their students to public schools, and we know why. Because they are resourced in a way that allows for every one of their students to be successful and to live into their brilliance. And we have to have the right to organize and agitate for those kinds of schools. We saw that kind of activism in our Red for Ed movement, that sea of red that spread all over this country, where parents and educators and communities came together to demand that our students get what they need and deserve. And then to fight for educators' their right to healthcare, and their right to compensation that would allow them to take care of their own families. I am so proud to be the president of this nation's largest union. And we know that America's workers deserve to have safe and supporting working environments. Our educators' working environments are our students' learning environments. And so that's why we argue so much for those environments that are safe and secure, welcoming, that allow our students to thrive. And then, when we ask our teachers and other educators to take on the incredible job of educating this nation's children, they should be able to retire with dignity, as should all workers in this country. We need to make it easier for workers to organize, not harder. So what we're going to be working on with Congress and with our new administration is to pass the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act, as well as the PRO Act. These two very critical pieces of legislation will help to make sure that workers have a voice in the workplace, and we can finally unrig the system so that it works to benefit all.
And we will be standing along your side, marching and calling and fighting with you. Congresswoman Jayapal, one of the stains left by President Trump will be his willingness to embrace not just hateful rhetoric, but hateful policies, to treat people of color and immigrants as a threat while empowering white nationalists. How do we repair the damage?
Well, I think that this is the crux of so much pain that people have been feeling across the country. And I go back to some things that Vanita said about what's at stake for us. You know, it isn't going to be enough for us to just win the election. I just was reading a report today in the Washington Post. It's a study, I forget the institute, I think it's called VDEM Institute, that looked at the rise in willingness of Republicans to attack their opponents with really horrific, hateful attacks, looked at the rise of Republicans willing to essentially trash the concepts of democracy for authoritarianism. And I think that this dynamic rests in large part on the ability to divide us and to do it on age-old tactics of racial division, gender division, and those kinds of issues. And of course, this has never been a hierarchy of oppressions, because every division based on oppressions benefits the oppressor. That is just the history of our country. And so we are going to have to, it will make an enormous difference to have in the White House somebody who sets the example of how we talk about immigrants, about how we talk about Black people. But if we don't actually do the work, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, on the ground to talk directly to people and change the dynamics of fear and scarcity that people are feeling, because that racial division only works when people are really afraid for themselves and they suddenly feel like it's either me or you, and I'm going to pick me. And so that's, if we lift all the boats economically, if we provide people with decent wages, with jobs, with the ability to take care of their families, with the ability to know that their kids are going to inherit a better future than they had, then we start to chip away at the reasons that people are able to use immigrants as a political football or Black people as a political divisive tool. That, I think, is the work we're going to have to do. And a lot of it starts with both the rhetoric we use, but also the policies that we use to show our deep respect for those essential workers who are on the front lines, who are largely Black and brown and indigenous workers, our deep respect for immigrants who are putting food on the table, and we call them essential, and therefore we can't be deporting them. We need to give them a place in this country where they can't be used against us. And for white working class folks who have been put in the position of listening to a demonization of other working class folks, because let's be clear, working class includes white, Black, and brown. And the more we can talk about and deliver results for people that puts money in their pockets, the less we allow that divisiveness to go forward.
I reflected on this so much during the pandemic, which is you can't be essential and disposable, and you can't be essential and deportable, right? And in so many ways, our government has failed people who are on the front lines, who are fighting this moment for us, and who are making sure that we have everything that we need, right, to get by in this moment. So just a stark reminder about the work that we still have to do.
And Lorella, if I can just quickly add to that very quickly and just say that the tools of racial demonization were handed to Donald Trump by Republican and Democratic presidents. I know that that is not popular to say, but if you go back to 1996, it was Bill Clinton who passed the IRA that started the criminalization of immigrants. And so we just have to recognize that we have handed tools to a dictator and he did terrible things with it, but the tools were given to him initially.
Absolutely. It's a system by design, right? And this is actually timely because I'm going to turn to Vanita to talk about our criminal law reform system. So Vanita, in the middle of a pandemic that disproportionately harmed Black and Brown communities, millions of people marched in Black Lives Matter protests against racial injustice and police brutality. Now, you led the police department investigations when you were at the Justice Department. And right now, as we transition into a different kind of governing moment, what are the prospects for meaningful reform of the policing and the criminal system more broadly moving forward?
So, issues around police accountability have been long entrenched in this country. I think the kind of constant problems around public safety, policing, racial justice, these are ones that have long plagued this country. But what we saw this summer in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis was just this incredible moment in the country. And I would say it really was feeding and building off of the Black Lives Matter movement from years prior, but building on it around, it was a multiracial movement. It's multi-generational. It really, this issue around policing and systemic racism, I saw a conversation happening in the country that frankly wasn't just limited to policing. And when you had NASCAR making the changes that it was affecting institutions and corporations kind of across the board. And the question is, can we sustain that and can we actually deliver? And I really want to take what Congresswoman Jayapal said to heart, which is progressives have fought really hard. They got a lot of folks registered. They got people engaged in this moment, but there has to be a kind of delivery on the issues that are really important. And there's no question that this set of issues around policing and justice remain crucially important. And I would say not just for communities of color, but for the entire country. I fully expect that a Biden administration is, and I will be among the first in line to make sure that a Biden administration is doubling down its efforts on civil rights enforcement and the role and the really important and unique role that the Justice Department Civil Rights Division plays in promoting and pushing and advancing police accountability, community police trust. But there was also, and I think this is important, is that there was in the immediate days after George Floyd's murder, the leadership conference worked very closely with members of Congress and the House to get the Justice and Policing Act as rigorous as it possibly could be on issues like, and some of these issues in the Justice and Policing Act seem like they're so basic that I had so many people saying, wait, we don't have a national use of force standard? No, we don't. We don't ban chokeholds nationwide? No, we don't. And a number of different prongs of the Justice and Policing Act that have been enacted in measures in states and local jurisdictions for many years. It's time for Congress to actually pass meaningful police accountability, police reform. It's really been since 1994, since when Congress gave the Justice Department the authority to investigate police departments that had unconstitutional patterns of misconduct. Congress hasn't really acted in a bold and comprehensive way on these issues. And I think that is part of what the clamor has been, at least from the federal government side. And Lorella, there's been so much incredible activism and advocacy and change at the local level, and policing is inherently local. There's 17,000 police departments around the country. And so what jurisdictions do at the local level matters so much, but the federal government, both in terms of the enforcement role it plays, but also in terms of federal law that can kind of change and set new standards, plays an incredibly important role too. And I suspect that there will be a lot of progressive pressure and momentum to make sure that we are deeply engaged in these efforts. It won't be easy, but it is something that we cannot ignore.
Thank you, Vanita. And I think, we've talked a lot about executive actions on this panel, in this conversation today. And I think it's just going to have to be really important that we not let Congress off the hook, that we not let the Senate off the hook, right? It doesn't matter what the outcome is in January. We are certainly hoping for a particular outcome, but they have to feel, right, the cost of inaction, right? And I don't think our movements, and I don't think they really know what they've got coming for them if they don't act swiftly to enact some of these reforms that we're talking about. So we've got a little bit of more time. Becky, I wanted to ask you, just following up on this conversation that we started with Vanita on the needed reforms to our policing and our criminal system. What steps should we be taking upstream to combat institutional racism?
So we need to take a look at the history of this country. We need to teach the history of this country. So let's talk about that. The complete history of this country, the honest history of this country. And we need to combat institutional, systemic, structural racism together in a holistic way. As I said before, every one of those systems impacts our students' ability to learn. For us in education, we are taking that journey of awareness ourselves. As I said before, at the NEA, we took on a commitment to taking on institutional racism about 5 years ago, right after the killings at Mother Emanuel Church. And we knew that as educators, we had to lead. We had to lead on racial justice in education. And part of that leading meant that we had to do the work ourselves, so that we took our own journey of awareness to build our racial justice muscle so that we could fight for our students. And so for us, we're looking at making decisions and challenging elected and appointed leaders in this country to make decisions that are based in racial equity. Not just decisions right now. So as we think about what is needed in the COVID relief package, we have to be thinking about how we are closing those gaps in inequities. But we also have to be thinking about systemic change long-term and how all of those social systems compound to impact the access and opportunities and outcomes for our Black and Brown students are students living in poverty. And so we're in a systemic way. We know that we have policies that one of the issues that we want the Secretary of Education to take on is what Betsy DeVos did almost immediately was to scale back the guidance from the Obama administration on discipline. We know that the school to prison pipeline is real, and we have to begin with implementing restorative practices in our schools, making sure that when we think about discipline in our schools, that we are enacting policies and providing support to create the kinds of environments in our schools that respect our students and their cultures and their families, that look at our communities as a place of assets that will join with us in that shared responsibility to ensure that every one of our students has a supportive and nurturing environment in which to learn. And so we have to take a look at criminal justice reform, and we have to do that within our schools as well to ensure that we are not setting up our Black and Brown and students and growing number of Black girls in particular. We are not setting them up for failure by putting them into that system right at the start, by disproportionately having them being represented in our special education classes and disproportionately not being represented in our AP and advanced classes and courses. Those are the kinds of things that we have dedicated ourselves as educators to do, but we cannot do it alone. We need the support of elected officials that are on this panel. We need the support of LCCR. And by the way, something else I wanted to say too. We oftentimes look at election cycles and we rally together and we get our Black and Brown communities, our community activists, grassroots organizations together to get the vote out, to register, get the vote out, and then we forget about them.
Mm-hmm.
We can't do that. We've got to work to build, and that's what we're at the NEA we're doing. We have to work to build their infrastructure so that they can continue to help us build that grassroots action so that the Biden-Harris administration has that push, that wind, so they can govern boldly and progressively. Our work has just begun. And we have to respect and honor all of those activists that were out on the line in our communities that were doing all of this hard work that led to this win.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot stop now. It's only just begun.
Yes. Yes. So we seize our moment, right? And we also honor the people who got us into this moment. Right. And we know that quite well at Community Change Action, where we don't believe in only electoral organizing, but in year-round organizing. And I mean, take a place like Arizona, right? That fight, the fight to turn around the state, started more than 15 years ago. And it was because brave, courageous people of color, led by Latinx folks, led by the immigrant community, decided to fight anti-immigrant laws in the state, and then take all of that energy and turn it into electoral energy, right? To elect the people we wanted to elect, to vote out the people we needed to vote out. And so it's such a good lesson for us in this moment to really not forget that you can't keep knocking on people's door if you don't ever deliver, right? And that is something that every Democrat, every person in elected office needs to remember now that the time is to govern and to deliver for people. So let's go ahead and turn into our final lightning round because it's been a real pleasure to be in conversation and in community with you all. This question is, what advice do you have for President-elect Biden? We've given them a lot of advice already. I hope they play this on repeat over and over again. But what advice do we have for the President-elect and his transition team as they staff up the next administration? I'm going to get started and then we'll do 1 minute each. I really do love this question because leadership is so important. You can have a bold vision, but if you don't have the people to make it happen, it's not going to happen, right? So from my perspective, if there's any major takeaway from the last 4 years, it's that leadership and integrity are so incredibly important to advancing a bold agenda, and that diverse and representative leadership is vital to implementing an agenda that centers the voices of those most directly impacted. So I look forward to the most diverse, their words, their promises, leadership the executive branch has ever seen, with Black, Brown, Latinx women, especially charting the way forward in this administration. And in particular, we're paying a lot of attention to see who the leader is going to be at the helm of the Department of Homeland Security. And importantly, that person believe that immigration is good for our country, that person have deep expertise on immigration policy, and that person have the skills and the commitment to lead a major institutional reorientation at the agency after it has spent not only 4 years relentlessly attacking and pursuing an anti-immigrant agenda, but as Representative Jayapal reminded us here, right, a system that has been built over many decades, right, to target immigrants and to target people of color. So I'm going to go ahead and give you all your minute, starting with you, Becky.
So for us in education, I will repeat that everything impacts us. So all of the staffing of the Biden-Harris administration, from Department of Labor to HHS to Homeland Security, all of that as we fight for our dreamers to a quality education, all of those things impact. In the Department of Education, And what the Biden team has promised is that they will listen to educators. First of all, that it will be an educator. That seems shocking that you'd have to say that, but you actually have to say that out loud now, that it will be an educator that leads that department, that they will listen to educators, that they will make sure that educators are part of creating and implementing education policy that is focused on transforming, because we do have to, it can't be around the edges. We've got to fundamentally transform the public education system so that it is racially and socially just and equitable, that educators will be consulted on teaching and learning decisions that impact our schools, and that they have committed. The people that they put in place in the Department of Education, starting at the top, will have made a commitment to addressing the racial and social injustices that have led to systemic inequities throughout the systems that have compounded to have a negative impact on the access and opportunities and outcomes, most especially for our Black and Brown and Indigenous students. That is what we are looking for in a Biden-Harris administration.
Vanita?
So I know we're short on time, so I will say this very quickly, but to echo what you said, Lorella, personnel is policy. And so it's really, really important. And eyes are on the Biden administration to set that course. The second thing is that it is possible to have bold policy platforms and unify the country. And if there is a sense that these things are in opposition to each other, I frankly think all of us are going to suffer, and it will show itself up in future elections. And so we have to make sure that this isn't seen as a dichotomy, while understanding the reality and the political reality that exists here in Washington, unless the Georgia runoffs change the makeup. And then the very third thing that I think is really important here is just to remember, and this is more for progressives, to understand the importance of the inside-outside game, to understand what and how to be strategic in this moment, of understanding how to play that inside-outside game to get things done, and to not be our own worst enemy in how we do this work and advance a progressive agenda in a Biden administration.
Representative Jayapal?
I would say to the Biden-Harris administration, celebrate the mandate that you were given. Over 300 electoral college votes, millions of votes, popular votes across the country. That is a mandate. Take it seriously and deliver bold change. Because at the end of the day, the thing that comes to my mind is a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that is the true measure of a society's worth is in how it treats its most vulnerable. And we have such vulnerability across the country, such pain across the country, recovery from a legacy of racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and also a cruelty of 4 years of a president who literally made people live in fear and destroyed so much of the lives and livelihoods of people across this country. So remember that you have a mandate, and that being bold is not actually about following, it is about leading the country forward.
Representative Pocan?
Very similar to what Pramila just said, go big and go bold, and bring people on board who want to go big and bold. Mr. President-elect, you have spent your entire life getting to this moment that you are now the President of the United States. Use this moment to do, your instincts are there, but let's get some big, bold things done and lead on those issues. We are leaving the worst president that's ever been leading this country. He's done so much damage. You know what to do, but let's seize this moment and lead with big, bold ideas and people who want to enact them.
Thank you. Thank you all for your leadership and for your insights. I am looking forward to working with each and every one of you as we work together to advance a progressive and a majoritarian 2021 agenda, truly centering those most directly impacted. I want to thank everyone who turned in, who submitted questions, and I wish we could have gotten through all of them. I want to thank you, Liz, and the team at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund for inviting me to this opening panel of the Progressive Strategy Summit. And I want to leave us all with Dr. King's words, so appropriate for this moment. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Liz, back to you.
Thank you, Lorella. Thank you for your incredible leadership and work at Community Change Action, building power with low-income people. And thank you to all of our panelists, Vanita Gupta, President Pringle, Representatives Pocan and Jayapal, for this truly important discussion. Now that you've heard about the road ahead, it's time to meet the new Progressive All-Stars who will be a driving force for change in the coming years. And to introduce this next session, I'm so happy to bring in an incredible member of the Progressive Caucus Action Fund team, our very own organizing director, Vimala Phongsavanh. Vimala, take it away.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to meet everyone. Before coming to DC, I worked to improve my community at the local level as an elected school committee member in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and as an organizer in our Southeast Asian communities. That experience on the ground prepared me for my future work in DC at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, and now PCAF. Here at PCAF, we work to build a more powerful progressive movement by lifting up the ideas of movement activists and policy experts and running issue campaigns to advance these ideas with policymakers. We make sure that the voices of everyday people are heard in Washington, D.C. Today, we're excited to meet a new set of progressive champions that voters across the country chose to lead. I'm happy to welcome our host for the rest of the afternoon, Maria Teresa Kumar. Maria is the founding president of Voto Latino, the country's leading Latino voter registration and advocacy organization. She is familiar to TV audiences as an Emmy-nominated MSNBC contributor. She also serves on the board of the Progressive Caucus Action Fund.
The election this year was truly like no other. Progressives made up great strides being elected up and down the ballot across the country. A record number of women and people of color ran. Victories depended on the Black, Indigenous, people of color organizers and led movements. A record number of women, LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous candidates won. Kamala Harris has shattered a glass ceiling as becoming the first African-American, South Asian vice president woman. People who delivered progressive victories in the election are looking for results from Congress and the administration. Over the next hour, we're going to meet the new Progressive All-Stars elected to Congress, as well as groundbreaking state and local leaders. We'll learn more about them and the issues they're championing. But before we meet the new members, we have a special message from one of the soon-to-be colleagues, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer.
Good afternoon. I am so pleased to join the Progressive Caucus in your seminar and your inclusion of new members from whom I'm going to hear on your panel. It's so exciting to see new people inject their views and their experiences into our deliberations. And I want to thank Chair Jayapal and Chair Pocan for their leadership of the CPC over the past 2 years. We had an extraordinarily successful and progressive agenda that we sent to the Senate. Sadly, of course, it sat untended on Senator McConnell's desk to the detriment of the American people. We did, however, pass major legislation on COVID-19 and responding to this crisis of health and of our economy. We're going to go into a lame duck session in just a few days. Our two most important items on that agenda will be to pass additional COVID-19 legislation to help the millions and millions of people who are suffering and need our help, and small businesses who need our help, and health providers who need our help. Let us hope that we can get a bipartisan agreement signed by President Trump. In addition to that, of course, we'll need to pass an omnibus appropriation bill so that we make sure that government is funded when we enter the 117th Congress unlike the 116th Congress. Your leadership, your visions will be critically important to accomplishing those objectives. We need to work on so many pieces of legislation that we were unable to realize in the last Congress. I mentioned COVID-19. That is our highest priority. President Biden and Vice President Harris have made that very clear, and they're working on it as we speak. Let us hope that we achieve a vaccine in the very near future, but we need to make sure that we make Americans whole in the process of waiting for that vaccine. Let me say that we need to pass issues that deal with the economy and jobs undermined by COVID-19. Our party has always been focused on giving opportunities to our people. That is the heart of our agenda, and we must pursue it vigorously. That will include infrastructure, which we promised 2 years ago, and which we passed overwhelmingly in our party and sent to the Senate again unconsidered. We passed voting rights reform. We passed campaign finance reform. We need to do that again. And in that bill of HR 1, we had redistricting reform. I think all of you understand how critically important pursuing redistricting reform and making sure that redistricting is fair all over our country for our federal offices and for our state offices as well. But we have authority over our federal offices. In addition to that, we have so many other pieces of legislation. We want to bring drug prices down. We want to strengthen the Affordable Care Act. Justice and policing, we passed a wonderful bill. We need to get that done. We need to address systemic racism in America. We need to make sure that every American, including our LGBTQ community, are treated as equals with the dignity that their persons demand. We also need to deal with the climate change, one of the existential threats to our global community and to ourselves. President-elect Biden has said we're going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. That's a first step, but we have a comprehensive report that we have before us in the House, and we needed to include that as we move forward and send climate legislation to the Senate as well. DACA, comprehensive immigration reform. How pleased I was, and I know all of you were, to hear that one of the first things President Biden is going to do is make sure that the DACA folks are protected, and then that we pursue comprehensive immigration reform. All of these are critically important for the American people. And the CPC will be intimately involved in creating and passing policies that will make a difference for the people. Let us always remember, however, as we go forward, not only in the lame duck, but in the next Congress, the 117th Congress, what our speaker says so cogently and so well. Our diversity is our strength, she says, and as all of you know, we have the most diverse caucus in history today, and we'll have the most diverse caucus in the 117th Congress. But she also adds, very importantly, unity is our power. We need to be unified if we're going to be successful. And I look forward as Majority Leader to working with everyone in our caucus to create the consensus for change that America voted for. America voted to redeem the soul and character of America in voting for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But they also voted for a government that works, that makes change in their lives for the better. I look forward to working with all of you to accomplish those objectives. God bless you.
Thank you, Majority Leader. It's now time to meet two newly elected progressives, Kai Kahele of Hawaii and Marie Newman of Illinois. MoveOn Executive Director Rahna Epting is here to lead that conversation.
Hello, my name is Rahna Epting. I'm the Executive Director of MoveOn, and I could not be more thrilled to be here with all of you today as we continue to celebrate our huge win and celebrate the clear mandate voters gave President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to lead and discuss how progressives in Congress continue to build our power to push for bold action on the economy, on democracy reform, healthcare, climate, and so many other vital issues that are important to the people of this country. The Progressive Caucus in Congress will be bigger, more powerful, and will make up a larger percentage of the Democratic Congress than it ever did before. Progressive candidates won in key races in every part of our country. We won in the East, we won in the South, we won in the North, and we won in the West. We won because we organized, we did the hard work. We had a virtual army of volunteers that made phone calls, sent text messages, wrote letters to voters, talked to their friends and family and neighbors. We won because we had excellent candidates. We won because people wanted an economy that works for all, not just the top 1%. We won because people want bold action on climate, on democracy, on the economy. And we won because of people like you, people who showed up to not just vote, but got everyone they knew to vote. So this victory is ours. It's all of us that showed up at the polls. But the election was just the start. Now comes the hard part. It's the work we get to do together, winning in Washington and in Congress on these bold ideas. That's the work that we now are able to drive. And just as we won at the ballot box, we can and we must win in the halls of Congress. Our work will be easier because we are sending several new champions to Washington. And today we have the honor of talking with two of them. We have Marie Newman from Illinois, who first defeated a Democrat in the primary who opposed a woman's right to choose. This person fought against LGBTQ rights and supported policies that made it harder for workers to organize. Marie Newman won as an unapologetic progressive in the primary and then again in the general election, and will be an outstanding leader in Washington. And we're also joined by Kai Kahele from Hawaii. He will be only the second Native Hawaiian to serve in Congress since Hawaii became a state and ran on Medicare for All and a Green New Deal. He's a progressive champion who understands the need to challenge the status quo and push for big, bold ideas. So Congresswoman-elect Newman and Congressman-elect Kahele, I could not be more excited for our conversation today. So let's dive in. And I want to ask you both, what inspired you to run for Congress? And I think we'll start with Congresswoman Newman.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for having me today. So pleased to be here with Kai. Thrilled at all of the work that is in front of us. And it is a daunting challenge. And it's not dissimilar from my decision to run. It was daunting. I was running against a dynasty of 40 years, a family that had been in place, father and son, for 40 years. And that's precisely why I ran, is that the district had been out of alignment with their representative for quite some time, and on critical issues for working families, everything from workers' rights to healthcare, to immigration, to a woman's right to choose, to civil rights. And there was a long list. So it wasn't one reason, it was many. And I couldn't be more thrilled that this district, my coalition, put all of the effort out, because here we are today having a great conversation.
That's wonderful. And Congressman Kahele?
There's so many reasons why I ran, but I think one of the most important ones is that I want to see my colleagues in the United States Congress try and pronounce my last name. And the fact that a Native Hawaiian is going to return to Congress, only the second time since statehood, I ran so that children across Hawaii who have brown skin, who are Native Hawaiian, who grew up as publicly educated kids across Hawaii can say, hey, if that guy can do it, I can do it as well. And so I ran to be an inspiration to the children of Hawaii and to be able to tell my story and to inspire them to be able to live their dreams and to be a leader on the national level. So I'm very, very excited, super humbled, and I'm ready to get to work with Marie.
That's wonderful. And just following up on that, we saw the first two Native American women elected to Congress in 2018, and you're the first Native Hawaiian to serve in Congress since the late Senator Daniel Akaka. What is the significance of this growing caucus of Indigenous lawmakers in the House to you?
It's huge. We have unique histories. We have the United States has unique trust responsibilities to Native Americans, to Native Alaskans, to Native Hawaiians. And it's important to have that diversity and that voice in the Congress, because the federal government has a obligation to the economic prosperity of our indigenous peoples in this country. And so, I'm looking forward to working with the other indigenous members of the Congress to elevate those discussions and to educate. Part of it is education. I'm learning about Native American history, Native Alaskan history, and they're not aware of the history that Native Hawaiians have with the United States of America. So I'm looking forward to somebody who can educate the other members of that caucus and the other members in the Congress so that we can help to advance those really important critical issues.
Thank you so much. We're so happy that you are part of the Congress now. Congresswoman Newman, you ran as a progressive challenger to a Democratic incumbent, Dan Lipinski, who often voted against immigrant and reproductive rights and continued on to a strong win in the general election. What does your election say about the progressive movement at this moment?
I think it says a bunch of things. I won't speak on behalf of the voters, so I have some very strong theories and guesses right now. I think that when you focus on the policy, things like Medicare for All, green stimulus, making sure that we protect and advance the rights of immigrants and protect our civil rights, that affects everybody's every day, right? Is that the proof is in the pudding. When a party, like I always call the Democrats the party of solutions, and Republicans often fight those solutions. We have to keep providing solutions that affect everybody's every day. So I think that I positioned that in a way where people really understood that I was very results driven and very focused on everybody's every day. And that resonated. That's the prevailing theory, and we will see. And now I have to prove myself, right?
That's wonderful. So what is your top priority in the 117th Congress as we look towards next year?
100%. And I think every member of Congress will say the same thing. Right now, it's COVID relief. We absolutely have to get funding to states, counties, cities, and municipalities, testing, healthcare, small business, and extend unemployment insurance. I think we're all dead centered on that. That is day one, minute of day one, right? Mm-hmm. Secondly, in my district happens to be rebuilding the economy and healthcare. And rebuilding the economy means that we are going to have to make massive investment into infrastructure and transportation systems. And oh, by the way, that means green union jobs all day long and twice on Sundays. So my district's very union driven, so I think they're excited about that.
That's great. And Congressman Kahele, what would be your top priority for the 117th Congress?
It's just like Marie said, it's COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and getting us through this right now. I'm looking forward. You talked about a new Biden administration. I'm looking forward to leadership at the top. I'm looking for a consistent message from the President of the United States to our state's governors through the National Institutes of Health and a coherent, solid message that can then be disseminated through the states. We need to look at reopening our schools. We need to look at getting people back to work again. And so, obviously an infrastructure stimulus package, every state is going to need it. If there's one thing, like Marie said, and I completely agree with, states and local municipalities cannot get through and cannot weather the economic catastrophe and recession of COVID-19. It needs sustained federal support. That means we're going to have to increase the national debt. But we need to do that so that we can weather the storm and we can get people back to work and we can make sure that people have the basics like healthcare, food, medication, housing, that they, the basics they need to survive. We need to weather them through this storm now, and we also need to look at getting them back to work. And so we have a lot of work to do, but
we got our work cut out for us. Can you both talk a bit about your districts and what the economic relief is that your communities specifically need? And I'm curious if it differs from Hawaii to Illinois or if it's very similar. Maybe we'll start with Congressman Newman. Yeah.
Sure. I'll go first. I would venture to say that my answer will be very similar to much of America in that my district is a microcosm. It's a very diverse district filled with workers, working family, and middle class folks. And overwhelmingly, I think people have learned some very harsh lessons. We've lost, is it 230 or 240,000 souls to date? That is, that heartache comes with a bunch of things. It comes with the deep mourning attached to losing loved ones, but also people are mourning the loss of jobs, the loss of healthcare. I think over 30 million of us have lost our healthcare because our healthcare was tied to our employment or our job, right? And I think we've all learned that that is not a good idea at the very least. So with all of that, I think people are looking to us, to folks like Congressman Kahele and I, to make sure that we prioritize rebuilding the economy, providing healthcare for all, and making sure that people have a bridge. It's that bridge that Kai just talked about, right? Is that here's the funny thing that our Republican colleagues always forget is that when we inject money back into the economy, states, counties, municipalities, hospital, healthcare, all those things, guess what? It produces revenue. And then we bring the debt down. So it's this funny thing. I always laugh when people say, oh, that we're going to go into debt. It's like, yeah, so that we can invest and we can make more money so that we can make the tax base better and bring the debt down. So it's really a sequenced process that has always worked in our economy. And I'm excited about making it work.
It's wonderful.
You know, for me, it's my district spans all of the 8 Hawaiian Islands. And so every single island is unique and their challenges are unique as well. You know, for my district, it's you know, rural broadband. It is diversifying Hawaii's economy away from the two you know, things that we've relied on the most, which is tourism and the military. I mean, those are the two things that drives Hawaii's economy, and that has brought us to our knees because we have no tourists coming to Hawaii right now. So I'm looking to put on overdrive agriculture and diversifying Hawaii's economic industry with agriculture. And so I'm looking forward to really being somebody that hopefully can serve on the Ag Committee and help shape the 2022 Farm Bill and just infuse diversifying Hawaii's economy around agriculture. So we're not so heavily reliant on tourism and on military spending.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the crises that we face in this country are immense, whether that's from the coronavirus, economic and health consequences, or climate change, or racial injustices that we've been experiencing since the beginning of the founding of this country. So we have a lot to do, and the people sent a clear message when over 74 million voted for the Biden-Harris administration. However, I think a lot of us were thinking that if we won the presidency, we were also going to take the Senate. And so now with the Senate, questionably, I know we still have 2 fights in Georgia to fight, but now with the fact that we most likely are quite possibly will have a Republican-controlled Senate, how are progressive legislators thinking about how they're going to approach the 117th Congress with this dynamic? And what does that mean for how you're going into your role to govern this coming year?
First thing is I can't wait for a Biden presidency so we can start getting rid of all these executive orders of this administration. DACA, Paris Climate Agreement, everything that this president has done to weaken this country can be undone by President Biden, hopefully minutes after he takes office. You know, there has just been an assault on middle-class America by this president, and I'm looking, first and foremost, I'm looking forward to that. But the reality is, if the Republicans maintain control of the United States Senate, then you know, it makes our challenge, you know, a little bit more steep. It doesn't mean that we don't keep fighting for the progressive core values and issues, healthcare for all, Green New Deal, a $15 minimum wage, climate change, and the things that we know that we need to do to continue, you know, pushing that progressive agenda forward. But it does make it a little bit harder. But I also think it gives us a unique opportunity to educate and to continue to have these conversations. If you looked at 2016, nobody knew what Medicare for All was until Bernie Sanders really brought it to the forefront and made it a topic of national conversation. And look at where we are today in 2020. And so it's all of those things are evolving. We're a part of that evolution. And so I'm looking forward to working on things like that.
Yeah, so much of our work, it's not just, so much of elected officials' work is not just, the very important work of governing and legislating, but it's also the important work of expanding the hearts and minds of people in this country to understand what is actually realistically possible. And so often we're stuck in this space of trying to get peanuts when actually we need to be thinking bolder, especially to have answers to the bigness of our challenges in this country. So I'd love to ask the same question of you, Congressman Newman. Like, how are you thinking about moving into the 117th Congress, knowing that we might not have friends in the Senate that are leading at the helm?
Yeah. We may have to face a reality where we are going to struggle to get things through the Senate. What I would say in that situation is that it should not deter us, because maybe it's a slowdown over the next 2 years of what we can get through, but it should not deter us. We should put these things through. But during this time, let's make sure we educate like nobody's business. It's what Congressman Kahele said. It's that we have to make sure that everybody understands that these are ridiculously practical things. This is the practical path. In fact, it's the only path forward. Things like Medicare for All, study after study after study. In fact, I've never found a study that doesn't say that Medicare for All will bring the cost of services down, bring the cost of pharmaceuticals down, preserve our quality of care, allow us to maintain whatever doctor that we wish, and make things easier for everybody. So let's educate everybody and make sure they understand the policy and stop branding everything. I frequently say that we get all wrapped up in that it's this or it's that. Talk about what it is and how it's what's in it for me is incredibly important to Americans, I will tell you. And so let's make it clear what's in it for them.
That's brilliant advice. I was just talking to a messaging strategist many of us might know, Anat Shenker-Asario, and she was saying we have to stop selling the recipe and really sell the brownie itself.
Yeah.
How does it actually impact people in their everyday life? That's what people care about. They don't really care what it's called or what the name of the bill is. So I want to ask one question around committees. Congressman-elect Kahele, earlier you mentioned interest in serving on the Ag Committee, and Congressman-elect Newman, have you given thought to which committees you might want to serve on? I'd love to hear both of your thoughts around where your interests lie.
Well, my goal is to sit on transportation, infrastructure, and small business, and here's why. In my district, we have more lines of track than any other district in the entire nation. And so we are a hub, a natural hub. I have Midway Airport. My background is in management consulting, and I've worked in transportation and infrastructure for probably 25 years. So I can understand our system as an ecosphere, not just in my district, but across our nation. I think we have to think about it more holistically, and we have to think about it in a way where we can progress forward with green transportation and infrastructure and make sure that we are modernizing our transportation system and our infrastructure systems. And then similarly in small business, about 80% of Illinois 3's economy is small businesses under 3 million in revenue. So I have very vested interest in, and then last of all, I just like both those things. So I'm excited to serve if they'll have me.
Wonderful.
Same here. T&I is probably my top choice that I'd like to serve on. I have my reasons why as well. Second would be armed services. We talked about how military is so critical to Hawaii. We always have had a member on armed services, so that would be a second very important committee for me. Going back to T&I, not too many people might know I'm a commercial airline pilot. I've been at Hawaiian Airlines as a commercial pilot for 11 years, and so I have a unique perspective on our country's aviation infrastructure and airports and pilots and the safety standards behind that. And so things like serving on the aviation subcommittee, I'm very interested in doing that as well. but same thing, the T&I committee is really important to Hawaii. Armed services as equally important, and then agriculture for the diversification of Hawaii's economy because of COVID-19.
Thank you. So I have one last parting question for both of you. A lot of folks that are joining us here today consider themselves progressive, or might use a different term, are fighting for racial justice, folks that are fighting for climate justice. Many of them are volunteers. Some of them are staff of organizations like the one I represent, MoveOn. What message do you have for folks that are watching that want to support you and help new progressives in Congress be successful? Like, how can we help you?
We're ready to come. We are progressive warriors. We are ready to come to Washington, D.C. I'm looking forward to meeting everyone. And it's going to take a team effort. Marie and myself and, Congresswoman Jayapal and Congressman Pocan and our other progressive champions in the Congress. We are your voices in Congress, but we all are voices across the country. And so, keep up fighting. And I'm just looking forward to meeting all of you and working together and continuing this, very progressive, populist agenda of moving this country forward along key things that are really important for our economy: a minimum wage, a livable wage, healthcare, climate change. Super important for this country to succeed.
Thank you. And Congressman Newman?
I would just add to those wise words from my friend Kai and say, let's stay together. We can have progressive policies that are very practical. We just need a lot of educators out there. So all of the amazing volunteers, I've seen MoveOn in action, baby, and they rock the world. So I got to tell you, they can do this. Let's all link arms, be good educators, that progressive policies are the most practical path forward. They're always based on best practices, and we can contemporize them and move them forward. So let's all move this ball down the field together.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of all the mass membership organizations out there, we want to, in the progressive sphere, we want to say we've got your back. We are here to help. We have millions of members all throughout this country, many of them in your districts, that want to see you be successful, that believe in what you campaigned on, and understand that we all have our work cut out for us in this new Congress. And so we got you guys. Let us know how we can be helpful, and best of luck in the 117th Congress, and congratulations once again.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day, guys. Bye-bye.
Mahalo. Aloha.
We're going to meet more members of the new freshman class in just a few minutes. But it wasn't just federal races on the ballot last week. State legislators, city council members, and other officials have an immediate impact on our communities. And today, I want you to meet 3 progressive leaders who are fighting to change at the state and local level. State Representative Attica Scott represents Louisville in the Kentucky General Assembly, and before that served on the Louisville City Council. She is an alumnus and advisory board member of Emerge Kentucky. Greg Casar has served on the Austin City Council member since 2014, and he's the incoming co-chair of Local Progress, a network of progressive local leaders. And for those who don't know, he's a Voto Latino alum. I'm so excited to see his career continue to grow and make impact. Last but not least, Helen Gim has served on the council member at large on the Philadelphia City Council since 2015. She's the other co-chair of the Local Progress. For all of you, congratulations, Representative Scott and Councilmember Casar, on your reelection last week.
Thank you.
So Representative Scott, I will start with you. Across the country this summer, people marched for racial justice after police brutally killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. You represent Breonna Taylor's hometown of Louisville in the Kentucky General Assembly. How have you been fighting for justice in the Republican-controlled legislature?
Thank you for that question. In fact, I'm the primary sponsor of Breonna's Law for Kentucky to end these no-not-death warrants across the Commonwealth, and to mandate alcohol and drug testing of officers who are involved in these shootings and other violent incidences, because as some people might know, one officer just wandered off for over an hour. No one knew where he was, and he came back and there was no accountability for him. So I am the primary sponsor. We have 11 legislative co-sponsors, but because my background is organizing and activism through Jobs with Justice, we're doing something different with this legislation, and that's to get community co-sponsors. And we have over 4,200 people who signed on as community co-sponsors. I'm very clear as the only Black woman in our entire state legislative body, and as a mom, that it's my responsibility to push forward with this legislation. It's also been my responsibility to show up on the ground with folks who are protesting and marching and rallying for justice. So I've been tear gassed, I've been arrested, charged with felony rioting, but I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to stop, because Brianna, her family, and her community deserve justice.
And thank you for your courage, but also for changing that into action by actually promoting the legislation that we need. Councilmember Casar, with the Senate Republicans blocking police reform at the federal level, the real change has been happening in states and cities. How has the movement for police reform played out in Austin?
Well, just a few years ago, Austin's politics around policing were stuck in the same dangerous status quo as we see in cities across the country. As a matter of fact, even though we're known as a liberal bastion, our city overinvested in policing per population more than any of Texas's other big cities, and the police association, other special interests, essentially ran those city politics. But a small number of organizers working alongside families of people most impacted by mass deportation, of which there was a lot more in Austin back then, and mass incarceration and police violence, worked together to build a mass movement. They started with incremental, smaller wins, pushing the council to rewrite use of force rules or to decriminalize truancy and low-level marijuana possession. We moved on to build a coalition of the Movement for Black Lives alongside the immigrants' rights movement to launch our state's first ever deportation defense fund and to stop needless arrests of people of color so that people wouldn't have to sit in jail, wouldn't face needless consequences just for being in lower income communities, and then also to slow deportation in our community. And then people built that bigger movement for real transformative change, where tens of thousands of people called in to block our police association contract until we had real transparency and accountability, and to make a historic reinvestment of tens of millions of dollars away from over-militarized policing back into our communities. What we've really seen since that change is that they're trying to push us backwards. Our governor actually had press conference after press conference denouncing the changes that we made in our budget. We saw in this election cycle how people jumped onto Austin trying to blame progressive victories here for losses potentially in other parts of the state. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, actually here in Austin, we saw turnout boom amongst young people and folks of color. In districts like mine, the lowest income district in the city, the most immigrant part of the city, we saw nearly twice the number of people vote this election than they did in 2016, delivering an even broader win for the Democratic Party and actually supporting every single incumbent that voted for a transformative reallocation of money away from over-militarized policing back into the community. So I really see us as a model place where we can show that if we lean into progressive movements rather than act defensively, when we channel that energy as organizers, local elected officials, and community, that not only is it the right thing, but it produces a win and helped make Texas be even closer than it's ever been before. Not that long ago, Mitt Romney won Texas by, like something like a dozen points.
16%. Yeah, 16 points. 16 points. I will not forget.
And then we brought it down to 9. And now it's down to less than 6, like 5.8.
Yeah.
And so that movement, imagine what we could do if we continue to actually show people that showing up in your local government matters, and that could shape your state legislature, and that can shape national elections, rather than not standing for much. The places where we really stood behind police reform, against mass incarceration, against mass deportation, that's where we saw the most success.
And, Cesar, something that I think that is really important, Gregorio, sorry. But, something, I always call you Gregorio. I met you Gregorio. I will always call you Gregorio, Greg. Something that folks always forget, but realize that investments matter. What we saw in Georgia didn't just happen. It was the efforts of Stacey Abrams and half a dozen other local organizations that said, we're going to double down on our state. And Texas is so close. I encourage people to say Texas could be the next Georgia. And when you talk about police brutality, something that we know, it is something that we are so aligned with the African-American community, with our brothers and sisters in the African-American community, because we know that it plagues them and it hurts our communities too. And how can we always make sure that we are making that transformative change that needs to happen together? And I want to bring in Councilmember Gim. You know, state and local governments have also been at the front lines in providing COVID relief. How has Philadelphia worked to protect workers in this pandemic?
Thank you so much. So, you know, we moved very quickly. We've been on a workers' rights agenda for a while since I first came in 2016. And as COVID began to work its way and hit city after city, we knew we had to move quickly. The first thing that we did was establish a permanent Department of Labor. We had an office, but we now have a permanent Department of Labor, which has a very explicit mandate to serve and outreach workers, to enforce existing labor laws, to educate, and to put out micro grants, for example, to organizations who can go and educate workers and businesses as well. We established an anti-retaliation law, which prohibits employers from retaliating against employees who might raise COVID concerns at the workplace. We all know that there is no CDC down at, you know, the local bakery or at an Amazon warehouse department, or, you know, at folks' nursing centers. And so we wanted to make sure that people who were in the focus on their public health as well as on their own health would not be retaliated against. So it enacted a clear anti-retaliation law that prohibits any employer from firing, demoting, taking action against an employee. We expanded paid sick leave. We have a 3-day paid sick leave law. We expanded it to 14 days through the expansion of the pandemic. And now we're working on a recall and retention bill for the hospitality industry, which has been one of the hardest hit industries. As the hotel and hospitality industry begins to reopen, we're asking that workers, the majority of whom were laid off, are Black and brown workers here in our city, are rehired based on seniority. It makes sense for the industry. It makes sense for our city and for our economy. We know that we cannot provide enough jobs for new jobs for previously those who were unemployed to regain economic security unless we ensure that the jobs that they had first prioritizes them. So we've been really aggressive in showing that we can do a lot of work on the local level, but we do have to take action. There's nothing that's going to happen passively. People have been working in this area for a really long time. We've been in great partnership with our unions, with labor, and with organizing groups around the city to show that a combination of those can really protect the public health, establish economic security, ensure that Black and brown workers are not left behind, and protect the city's economic security overall.
Well, and I think that something that you bring up is the importance of how everybody came at the local level to the rescue, more or less, at filling in the void that we saw by the federal government. And so I want to open this up to all of you. One of the things that was most striking is that the CARES Act provided stimulus checks to millions of Americans, but it left close to 20% of the Latino workforce out of it, either because they were U.S. citizens living with an undocumented loved one, or the person was undocumented, and they left out roughly 1.5 million Asian Americans facing the exact same obstacles. And so one of the things that we saw pop up is ways for local government to take care of these mixed status families. And I have to say, you know, when the CARES Act came out, I know how difficult it was for it to pass, but it was something that genuinely hurt the heart, recognizing that undocumented immigrants paid close to $27 billion in taxes and yet received zero of relief, while our president paid less than $800 in his own taxes. And so talk a little bit about Councilman Casar, how Houston went and tackled this issue, but I'd love to also hear from Representative Scott what was happening at the state level.
We know that the pandemic, on top of all this, hit immigrant communities especially hard. for a long time, the majority of our hospitalizations here in Austin were Latino families, primarily Spanish-speaking families. And I was just actually up the street not that long ago at the local high school for a food bank and school supply drive where the line of cars was about a mile long, almost entirely immigrant families, because they've been cut out of unemployment. They've been cut out of so many federal relief programs, cut out of COVID relief. And so what we were able to do here was pull into our local rainy day funds to make sure that we could get people direct cash assistance and pay for their rent and pay for basic necessities like food out of our own local funds. It's still so important that we get another COVID relief package out into the community so that our cities can continue to manage public health and continue to support those folks that aren't undocumented to free up those rainy day reserves for the people that the federal government continues to cut out. But frankly, it's, our essential workers are the people who have kept this country going long before the pandemic. The pandemic has made it especially clear, and it is just making those injustices even more real and even worse if we don't push our local governments to dig in as deep as we can go to support those undocumented folks who are making it through despite being hit by all the worst parts of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and such an important question. A lot of people don't know that Kentucky has a large immigrant and refugee population, in part because of our agricultural community. And so we know how hard folks were hit with COVID-19, and I see every day the emails and phone calls around unemployment insurance. One of my colleagues and friends, Representative Nemo Kulkarni, is the first ever Indian immigrant to serve in our state legislature. She's really been leading the effort to, one, hold accountable the system of unemployment insurance here in Kentucky, because it has not been doing the work that it needs to do to meet the needs of both of the communities that we serve, but also making sure that our colleagues in the legislature really step up the work that they're doing to make sure that both the Asian and Native Indian and Latinx communities are receiving their unemployment insurance benefits. I'm doing the same with folks that are in my community, predominantly Black community. But we also know that the way that we build power so that we can address all the other economic and social issues is that we have to work together, because, God willing, COVID will recede if people actually do what they're supposed to do, which I hope they do, because in September I was diagnosed with COVID and thank goodness recovered.
Oh my goodness.
But if we want to build power so that we don't find ourselves here again, we're going to have to come together as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because nobody's going to come and rescue us and save us.
Hear on that. Each of you is a trailblazer. Representative Scott is the only Black woman in the Kentucky General Assembly. Councilmember Gim is the first Asian American woman on the Philadelphia City Council. Councilmember Casar is the son of Mexican immigrants and the youngest ever member of the Austin City Council. Representative Scott, what difference does it make to have diversity in our communities reflected in our government?
It makes a significant difference because not only does it say to people that I can do that as well, but it's also important when you're on the ground marching side by side with your folks. It makes a difference in the kind of legislation that you're trying to advance. It makes a difference in the way that you bring people into the halls of decision making, where they have often felt powerless and voiceless, that you are taking the people's house and actually making it the people's house, that you are making sure that folks who have felt powerless and voiceless also know that not only do we need your vote, but we want to see your name on the ballot so we can vote for you as well. That's what representation does, and that's why representation matters.
And how do we create more of a pipeline? Casar, Councilman Casar.
I think that we have to keep on thinking about not just elections from as a cycle to cycle thing, but how are we doing organizing all the time? Because when we're organizing, we're winning. Things that might seem like a loss aren't actually a loss if you're building power and building people up. I myself, when I was a young organizer at Workers Defense Project, our immigrant worker center here in Texas, I worked for years on pushing City Hall, and for years couldn't get a meeting with the mayor. For years, lose time and time again. But then, because we built that power and built up young people and young organizers, I got brought into office, and we moved the minimum wage in just a short period of time from $7.25 to $15 an hour. The people we organized, the formerly incarcerated folks we organized around fair chance hiring, even though that was really hard, then went along to push out horrible state representatives in Austin, went on to run their own elections, went on to block that police union contract. So we have to realize that we're not just organizing to have short-term policy wins, but actually to build that pipeline and build longer-term power.
So with that, Councilwoman Gim, what would you say to young progressives, especially Black, Brown, and Asian activists considering running for office? What would you ask them? What advice would you give them?
One, I would say, stay local. I think it is exciting work that's happening on the ground. Local work is not just about, only looking at, certain things around zoning and other things. We are a sanctuary city here in Philadelphia. We have established like a fair work week law. We can carve out things that have been moving and transforming movements all around the country. The Fight for 15, paid sick leave, Black Lives Matter, policing reform, reclaiming our public school system. Those are all issues and organizing movements that are moving at the local level. It's energizing people through our streets. And then it gives people the expansive belief that politics is relevant to their lives. And so I encourage anyone who's out there, you don't have to wait for a politics that only happens twice a year at the ballot box. If you are young and Black, your life is political. If you're an immigrant or a daughter of immigrants or a child of immigrants, your life is political right now. Our lives are political, and we should behave like they are and embrace the movements that are moving in this work.
And so one last question for all of you. I think sometimes there is a disconnect on what happened, not sometimes, oftentimes there's a disconnect of what's happening at the national level and what is actually happening at the local level. You are all on the front lines. You are seeing this emerging rise of the American electorate that, the representative from Kentucky alluded to, Representative Scott alluded to earlier, talking about how it's important to talk and mobilize and march next to your community. What advice do you send right now to Washington, to the new president-elect, Vice President Biden, and Vice President, Madam Kamala Harris? What advice do you share with them? Because one thing we don't want to lose is this momentum of young activists that have come involved, that have worked their hearts out for the last 4 years, and maybe to the chagrin of maybe not getting anything done in Washington. What advice do you give them?
Well, one of the things that I will say to them is, for example, in Louisville, the movement for justice for Breonna Taylor is not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the movement that grew out of Ferguson is not going anywhere. So if you want to have a strong foundation and not build your tenure on a shaky ground, you best listen to the folks who have been showing up for justice, who turned out and voted for you to get you in office. We did that for our community. We didn't do it for you per se as Harris and Biden, to be honest with you. We did it for our communities because we knew we all deserve better. And now we're gonna hold your feet to the fire and hold you accountable. This GOP light is not gonna work. We want to defund police. We want to dismantle the system. And so you best get on board and be there with us.
All of us who came in also had to build out our own systems of mobilization. The progressive left saved a lot of Pennsylvania and the major cities where the Biden-Harris team won. It's important for the administration and for others to recognize that we are going to have to build out many of our own systems. The current ones are not functioning right now. They're leaving too many people out of it. And so immigrants, folks of color, Black Americans are going to have to unite and form a larger majority. We are the American majority.
Mm-hmm.
And we know at the local level that progressive policies that actually help working people tend to be more popular than politicians ourselves. We know that because we have to get people down the ballot. We have to talk to people at the grocery store or at the bus stop. And so we know that what energizes people is actually showing them a positive view of how we can make their lives better. People certainly went and voted against Trump. But if we want people to stay in this, and if we want to keep on winning, then we have to actually do the right thing and show people that we have a positive alternative. So people that embraced bold progressive policy helped win this election at the local level, and we're ready to keep on doing that in partnership with a new Congress and a new president, and we're ready to put in that work.
It's fantastic, every one of you, for stepping up and mobilizing and representing your communities so well. Thank you for the work you're doing. Truly, truly transformative. So thank you all. Now it's time to meet two more members of the incoming freshman class in the House. Jamaal Bowman of New York, and Teresa Leger Fernandez of New Mexico. Here to lead this conversation is Shane Larson, Board President of the Progressive Caucus Action Fund and Senior Director of Government Affairs and Policy at the Communication Workers of America. Shane?
It's a real honor to be moderating this conversation with these two unapologetic progressive and newly elected members of Congress. These are critical times for those of us in the labor movement as we work to undo the damage that the Trump administration has done and rebuild power for working people in our economy. But it's also a time of great opportunity. We are in an environment where a majority of Americans want to join a union. And in the midst of this pandemic, all workers are seeing firsthand the benefits of having a union in terms of safety and health protections on the job, paid leave, and just having a voice in your workplace. We're excited that these two incoming members and so many others recognize that fundamental as well. And we're all counting on these new champions to help us build that strong worker-led movement from their new roles in Congress. So thanks for joining, and let me introduce the two members joining us for this discussion. First, Jamaal Bowman was elected to New York's 16th Congressional District in the Bronx and Westchester. Jamaal got national attention when he defeated the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in his primary this summer. He's a middle school principal and advocate who's committed to fighting for schools and education, not bombs and incarceration. Teresa Leger Fernandez will be representing New Mexico's stunningly beautiful 3rd Congressional District, covering Santa Fe and northern New Mexico. New Mexico now has the largest all women of color delegation in the House. As a lawyer, she has fought for civil rights and community development. She was also appointed vice chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation by President Obama. Congratulations to both of you and all your supporters. We're all so happy that you guys are here. So I'm going to start off the conversation with just the first sort of general question. Let's start with you, Jamaal. What motivated you to run for Congress?
I had worked in education for 20 years and worked in what we call Title I schools. And Title I schools are schools that are historically underfunded. They exist within historically neglected communities, and they disproportionately serve Black and Latinx students. And when students live in concentrated poverty, they deal with something called concentrated trauma. And that trauma results in just horrible outcomes, whether it's related to education, health, or their local community economy. And I was tired of seeing children suffer. I was tired of seeing my students suffer. I was tired of seeing their families suffer. And for me, the tipping point happened in 2017, 2018, when 34 children died within the K-12 school system in the Bronx, and 17 died via suicide. And one student died by suicide right across the highway from our school. She was a 9th grader who was bullied in school. And right after school one day, she went to the top of a building and jumped off right there in Co-op City. And right down the street, also in the district at New Rochelle High School, 2 girls got into an argument. One pulled out a knife, stabbed the other, and killed her. And there was silence from our elected officials, and no one was really centering the most vulnerable children in our communities and making a connection between horrible, oppressive policy that's come from Washington for many years and these horrible outcomes. So I got to the enough is enough moment and decided to run, and thankfully we're here because we were able to pull out that victory.
That's great. Well, we're all so glad you're here. Teresa, what about you? What motivated you to run for Congress?
You know, I think it's very similar to what we were hearing from Congresswoman-elect Jamaal Bowman. But as he was talking about those children, he was talking about kind of the love he has for those students, for the community. And I had a sense that everything we love, right, our future, if we're not investing in our education, our healthcare, our planet, this beautiful place we call home, that what we love was under attack. because we're not following the science, we're not investing in our education, we're ignoring and allowing the climate crisis to get out of control. And that I had a sense that I wanted to run from a place of loving my community so much, of loving democracy, of loving these ideals, and that I wanted to run with a sense that we need to protect them, right? Anytime you love something, whether it be a family member, a friend, or an ideal, you know, when it's in pain, you want to protect it. And you want not just to protect it, but to help it thrive. I have spent the last 30 years of my life working in my communities of New Mexico. I was a Head Start baby, fell in love with learning, and ran off and was trained as a rebellious lawyer at Stanford Law School. And what a good rebellious lawyer does is listen. And I've been very fortunate, and I've been able to listen to people from, you know, the labor leader who had his throat cut and was denied asylum by the United States, Native American communities who suffer some of the worst conditions and have suffered some of the worst outcomes from COVID, Latino civil rights. You know, I've been able to work on amazing things over the last 30 years. And I wanted to bring that experience to DC, but also bring the experience of actually having worked on the ground, right, and implementing some of the solutions. I often talk that you need to know to represent my district, you need to know not just that beauty you talked about, but also its poverty. And so it's that knowledge of both its beauty and its poverty that sort of was my call to action to jump into this race.
Great. So one of the things you talked about was your love for democracy. And one of the things we've seen this year, the last couple of years, but especially this year, has been our democracy has really been put to the test. You successfully have fought over your time for voting rights and against gerrymandering. What are some of those democracy reforms that you want to see enacted under your leadership in Congress?
Right, and especially this last election, right? But it's always been there, but this last election was so craven, right? The attack on our democracy. You know, after our last redistricting battle and trial that we won the Voting Rights Act issues, a documentary was done about our redistricting, our legal battles, and it was called Reclaiming Their Voice, the Native American vote. And I think that this is the key thing, that what we want to make sure we do is democracy is about making sure that every voter's voice is heard. Because that's what democracy relies on, right? That's how we have self-determination about what our future should be. But we need to make sure that those voices are heard and that they're not drowned out by corporations, because that's not a voter, right? Or by other kinds of interests that undermine them. So I want to work on those things that actually strengthen the ability of those who have been disenfranchised to have their voice heard. And that includes things like H.R. 1, right? The For the People Act. We need to get that passed again. We need to get through the Senate. It includes, you know, the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we now know that we've learned a lot from this election about what else we need to add to that. You know, if you have to wait for 8 hours in line, because you're in a working class or a minority district, and across the city, they're only waiting 20 minutes, there is something wrong. And those are the kind of indicia that we can say, let's get the lessons that we've learned, let's get the abuses we've learned from this last election and do what we need to do. So you can vote by mail, it can be safe. You start counting the votes early. But I'd also like to address ranked choice voting. You know, I won that in our Supreme Court, and we then had ranked choice voting in some of our elections, some of the biggest turnout. And the other thing is, it was about policy. Those elections were about policy because people were focused on what am I bringing and not on the attack. So I'd love to also see some ranked choice voting legislation. It passed across the country in a couple of places. So there's a range of things we need to do. And I think that there is momentum and energy to get that done because it is so key. That's what we've seen over the last week and over the last several months and the last 4 years.
That's great. Your passion is really on this issue is really clear. Mr. Bowman, in your campaign, one of the things you ran against was endless wars and militarism. How do you think we need to reorientate our national priorities on a global scale?
I think we need to focus more on climate change. Climate change is not only a problem here in this country, it's a problem all over the globe. And our military is one of the #1 contributors to the climate emergency that we're living with today. So when we talk about reallocating resources from police officers because of our punitive measures, we're also talking about reallocating our military resources toward dealing with the issue of climate change. And it's time for our country to become a humanitarian leader in the world and implement what I often call a 21st century Marshall Plan. And we have to be honest with ourselves. We have been disruptive in Central and South American politics and the economy. We have been disruptive on the African continent. We have been disruptive in the Middle East. And our disruption has led to not just climate catastrophe, but a refugee crises, as well as military conflicts all over the world. So we need to finally end the forever wars, finally end investing trillions of dollars to kill hundreds of thousands of people to the benefit of only the military industrial complex. It doesn't make the world a better place. It doesn't meet the needs of the people right here in our district. And we need to reorient towards, okay, what are the needs of the American people? Universal health care, a Green New Deal, housing as a human right, fully investing in our public schools, universal childcare, all of the things that help people not just to survive, but to thrive. It's about giving everyone an opportunity, regardless of race or class or background, in this country and all over the world. If we're going to engage the world, we need to do it from a humanitarian perspective, not a military perspective.
That's so true. So true. Congresswoman-elect Fernandez, COVID's underscored a lot of the unmet healthcare needs across the country, especially in rural areas. How do we need to address these issues and needs long-term?
Right. COVID has, what it's done is shown a bright light on what many of us already knew, right? That our healthcare system is broken and that those most at risk have been those most harmed. In New Mexico at one time, even though our Native American population is only 10%, they accounted for 50% of the deaths. I've helped build rural health clinics that really look like what I'd love to see our healthcare look like, where you walk in and, they do what they need to do to find out where, how the care is going to be paid for. But from after that moment, it is about serving you in a culturally appropriate manner so that you need healthcare that is in your community. And if your community is ravaged by diabetes, let's make sure we have the kind of care to deal with it. Let's make sure we have the exam rooms that are large enough to treat not just you, but your family, because anytime you have a behavioral health, diabetes, addiction, it's affecting not just you, it's affecting the family and it's affecting the community. And so those are the kinds of, I've seen what it could look like, and it is what we need to make sure happens everywhere. Because, these 2 or 3 clinics I've helped build, that doesn't cover the rural need. And it's that lack of access in the rural areas that I think is really important. But we often have access even in the middle of a city, right, where people cannot access healthcare in a way that is affordable. I would like us to say, as we are doing our big recovery bill and looking at investments to bring us out of the recession, let's talk about infrastructure being not just clean water and roads, but also the broadband we need for telehealth, the health clinics we need, the schools we need, that we expand our definition of infrastructure to cover everything that a community needs to thrive. Some of those things are what, Congressman-elect Jamaal Bowman just mentioned. We need to say that it's all interconnected, and that if we're going to have thriving communities, we need to make sure they have the healthcare they need, the education, the clean water, the broadband. We need to see the connections between each of those elements.
As someone that represents workers in the telecommunications industry, glad to hear you talk about broadband and the need for broadband. One question for both of you. There's been a lot of chatter coming out of the aftermath of this election that we're sort of in a moderate political environment. And some are suggesting that we as progressives might need to temper our expectations on what can be achieved. As proud progressives, what do you guys have to say about that? How do we advance the policies that reflect our deeply held progressive values when it's being suggested that maybe we need to moderate a little bit? Why don't we start with you, Congressman-elect Bowman?
Well, what I've tried to do is simply respond to the needs of the people in my district. So the policies that I'm fighting for are in alignment with what I heard on the campaign trail and what I've experienced throughout my personal life as well as my professional life as an educator. So, universal health care is both the morally right thing to do because no one should die because they don't have health care, but it's also beneficial for community and economic development. The more people are alive, the more they can contribute to the development of our communities and of our nation. I've worked in schools where, there are 34 kids, 35 kids in a classroom. If you go to a poor school and students are Black and brown, but if you go down the street to a wealthy school district, there's only 20 kids in the classroom and they have all the resources that they need to thrive. I lived in public housing, so I know how we've disinvested in the housing projects and public housing and how dilapidated they have been because we've been disinvesting for 30 years and they haven't received a dime in the last 10 years. So the progressive values we are champions of, they don't just come from us, they come from the people we serve. And the majority of the American people support Medicare for all. They support a Green New Deal. They support allowing workers to unionize. They support fighting against wealth inequality and ensuring that the wealth that's generated is shared with labor. These things are supported by the majority of American people. So I disagree with the notion that we need to temper it down because we need to continue to be champions for the people that we serve.
That's great. What about you, Congresswoman-elect Fernandez?
I love what Congressman Bowman is saying all along. I'm going to go, yes, because actually, what we're talking about, like when I go out and meet, and I have some incredibly conservative areas of my district, and I go out or maybe even conservative on issues like abortion. And I'll say, we don't agree there, but let's talk infrastructure. And when we start talking infrastructure, they get into it and they say, I know I don't agree with everything with you, Teresa, but we need infrastructure. When we talk rural health, we need that. When we talk affordable housing, we need that. New Mexicans support, majority of them support. We have polls. They might react to names, but when you talk to the principles of what are we talking about, they want to make sure they have access to healthcare. They're not paying too much. They can afford it. It's available to all. When you talk about broadband, they want to make sure that that's available to all because they see it as essential. When you talk about the climate crisis, New Mexico depends on fossil fuel to fund its schools. And yet the majority of New Mexicans know that we cannot keep that Faustian bargain, that we must move beyond that, and that we love this beautiful place we call home so much that we need to move it because we are a landed people. We love our air, land, and water. And they say, yes, we need to make that transition, start moving through it. I think what's key is to say, what are the principles we're talking about? Not the names people are calling things, but what are we trying to do for people? And when we communicate the actual policy, the actual difference it makes. When I'm talking to farmers and I have ranchers that support me, I want huge in our rural communities, 70%, 80% in my rural counties. It's because they like the idea that I'm saying, let's make sure that you can stay on the land you love and still help us save our climate by doing regenerative. But that means we have to invest in your community. And they go, oh yeah, we like that, And so I think that's it. We have to talk about what we're talking about. That's exactly what Jamaal was saying is let's talk about what it is. It's affordable housing. Do you want affordable housing? Yeah, we want that, right? And that's how we go about it, I think, is really focused on what we're trying to accomplish. And, and we have to figure out how to toss aside the name calling and to call it things. My opponent tried to put all kinds of names on me and I was lucky. my voters said, no, Teresa's actually talking about the stuff we want. She's not this, elite socialist, radical. She actually called renewable energy on solar panels in Navajo as extreme. And when people do that, you go, no, that's not extreme, but let's focus on what that means. Let's get renewable energy out where we can't get it, right?
That's great. So what I hear from both of you is we need to lead with our values because we know our values are popular and that's what the majority of the American public wants, or the things that we are fighting for and value. Thank you. Those are great answers. Congressman-elect Bowman, one question is, you're coming into Congress from a unique perspective in that you've had over 20 years of experience as an educator. What do you think, as someone with that deep background and really working on the front lines, what should the federal government be doing to improve education for all students across the United States?
We need to do a lot. Teresa talked earlier about a holistic perspective and a holistic view. One of the things we're arguing and trying to help people to understand is our schools can no longer exist in a vacuum, in isolation by themselves. They have to work with community-based organizations. They have to work with healthcare, and they have to work from the perspective of economic development as well. So if we think about our most vulnerable children in the center of a circle, surrounded by schools, surrounded by healthcare, surrounded by community-based organizations, surrounded by parents, that holistic view is going to be key. And fully investing in our Title I schools and fully investing in IDEA, which is the federal special education law, is going to be key. Neither one has been fully funded. IDEA has never been funded at more than 40%. And our children with special needs are suffering the most as a result. So fully funding our Title I schools, fully funding IDEA, taking a holistic approach, which means the building, and we're pushing for the building of 25,000 community schools that take this holistic approach, that have a collaborative leadership infrastructure, not just principal at the top, but principal working with parent leaders, working with student leaders, and working with others in the community, running the school in the community as like a learning organism. And the other thing we need to focus a lot more on is early childhood education, particularly from birth to age 8, because there's so many children and families who struggle to find childcare, to find employment with postpartum and so many other issues from birth to age 3. And if trauma is intense at that age, then a child is less likely to enter kindergarten and ready to thrive in school. So we need to focus on early childhood, provide a nurturing, caring, loving environment so that our kids are ready to enter school and thrive in kindergarten. So those are a few adjustments we need to make at the federal level.
That's great. We're so fortunate to have someone of your deep experience coming to Congress.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one last question. So Congresswoman-elect Fernandez, your district has a lot of precious natural resources, cultural resources, and public lands. I think it really is one of the most beautiful districts in the country. We face, how will you be working to protect all of that for future generations?
Yes, we do have a very beautiful district. And part of the problem is we have this oil and gas industry that I talked about earlier that we need to transition away from in order to protect those sites. And what I'd love us to do is recognize that all of our public lands, that they serve a purpose and that they are public. Like all of our different public lands, they have different like missions, right? This one, USDA does this and BLM should be doing this and we should be extracting as much as we can, rather than taking a longer view of these public lands need to be preserved for generations, right? They need to serve us, and is the best way they serve us by helping clean up our climate, or is the best way they serve us, putting that lens on them, is this exacerbating a problem or creating opportunity, right? And if we actually put a lens on that, it's like, no, let's stop the new development. Let's stop the fracking on the public lands, and let's make sure we don't give up like a short-term gain of maybe we'll have a little bit of natural gas coming out of there, but we have ruined Bears Ears or Chaco Canyon or these other amazing, beautiful sites who tell us a little bit about our past but also sometimes about our future, because if you don't take care of the land and you have drought, it's a problem. So I think what we need to do is look to preserving those. And I'm a public land, my mountains are my heart. So I'm going to do everything I can to protect them and to protect our air, land, and water, and getting to that wonderful place where we've moved beyond for future generation. That's the protecting what we love part.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time. I could have done this for a while. And I know we all look forward to continuing this conversation once you guys are sworn in at the beginning of the new Congress, and continuing to fight side by side for those progressive values we all love. We can't wait to get you all sworn in, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Shane. Over the past hour, you've heard from 7 amazing leaders who are championing for progressive priorities at every level of government. We have leaders in city halls, state capitals, and the halls of Congress who are ready to fight for us, but they can't do it alone. We need to keep mobilizing and organizing because real change comes from the ground up. To learn more about the Progressive Caucus Action Fund and the Progressive Strategy Summit, please visit progressivecaucusactionfund.org. Thank you for joining us today. The summit continues tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. See you then.